Tukaram, Prabhu.
Yes, Prabhu.
Okay. As you Haribo, as you know, this is a farm, so people have to take showers and shake the hay and remove their boots and all that stuff. So they will be arriving momentarily, but we can start whenever you want, since you have limited time, right?
I mean, you tell me. I'm happy to wait a few minutes for people. No problem.
Okay, we can do that. Why don't you tell me about your project or projects?
Why don't you tell me what's going on over there at the farm?
Well, we live in the projects. The farm. Well, the farm, we have people who come as students, and with very little direct encouragement. Now they want to come and practice bhakti. So it's nice. We have a student who's going to just came yesterday with her mom, and she's staying until the end of August. I met a couple that she's a hairdresser in Baltimore, and one of her people she was cutting hair to told her about Gita Nagari. So she and her boyfriend came over, young people, tattoos and all that. And I talked to them. They stay overnight. They love the place. So now I send beads and Gitas with them, and they're chanting regularly every day. And
how far is Baltimore from you guys?
I say 2.5 hours, maybe 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours, depends what part of Baltimore you go to.
I remember if I'm not mistaken, Philadelphia is about an hour and a half from you guys. Is that right?
No, it's like 3 hours from us. New York is 3 hours. Philadelphia is maybe 2.5 hours. It goes to 3. Everything is New Jersey is about 3 hours. Boston is about 6 hours, I think. I mean, you can call Gita remote. Yeah, if you live in Mayapur, it's remote. But if you live in the East Coast, it's anything but remote. There's 18 milking cows, where the first certified organic ahimsa dairy in the country. There is a garden, do CSA, sell boxes of produce to people that they buy subscriptions. There is worship going on of the fabulous Srila Damodar. When is the last time you were here?
I came there, I want to say 5 years ago. They had a Varnashram conference.
Okay.
And so I think it would have been 2016 or 17. I came there, stayed.
As part of the Kshatriya contingent?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
They had me give some lecture on Varnashram.
Okay.
Which surprisingly is we're gonna touch on today. It comes up in the Ramananda Sambad. Hey, Radha, could you grab me a Gita real quick? Prabhupada Gita.
Yes, Ramananda was a Sudra by caste.
That's also true, but that wasn't what I was thinking.
Okay.
But there's just give me 1 second. I'm just gonna pull it up real quick. Let me know when we've got enough people here to get started, and we'll get started.
Let me change the view and I tell you we have 7. I think it's going to go up to probably 20. So there's no need.
Start.
Prabhupada said, in business and prasadam, you have to wait for nobody. So this is a mercy of the Lord, considered prasadam. So we wait for nobody.
I'm ready. I'm happy to wait. I'm in like.
I'm not. If people are not punctual, they shouldn't be awarded a prize for being not punctual. So let them. It's like when you give a Sunday feast lecture, and there is 100 devotees and one newcomer. I disagree that we should give the Krishna consciousness 101 lecture. I think we should give a lecture for the majority, and the newcomer has to catch up. So it's their problem, not ours.
Got it.
So if people come late, that's their problem, not ours.
Accepted.
All right.
Hold on once.
So let me know when you're ready. Oh, actually, while you're multitasking, like whistling and milking a cow at the same time, I'll give a little intro, although people know who you are. Maybe. I will give a little intro. Tukaram Prabhu is a disciple of Lokanath Swami. He's been around for a long time, and one of his skills predominantly is the gift of gab mixed with Krishna consciousness. So this is a very good combination when used properly. So he is going to use it today to tell us a bit about Ramananda Roy. Ramananda Roy, as everybody probably knows, is one of the, I'm hesitant to say 3.5. I would say 4. 4, even though it's in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, I would say the 4 closest the 4 closest associates to Lord Chaitanya, which were Sikhi Mahiti and his sister, Madhavi Devi, Ramananda Roy, and Sarupa Damodar. All 3 of them, Madhavi Devi, Sikhi Mahiti, and Ramananda Roy, were born in the village of Alalanat, which is about 12 miles from Jagannath Puri. I took that trip on a local bus, and it takes about 45 minutes to transverse those 12 miles. Maybe they fixed the road since then. It's been a long time. There is a beautiful deity, Lord Alalanat is a black deity of Narayan, and Lord Chaitanya, upon seeing this majestic deity, he fainted, and the floor under him melted. So they still have that piece of floor, that rock that melted under the body of Lord Chaitanya with the shape of Lord Chaitanya's body extended in ecstasy. So, okay, the rest is all up to you. I did my 1%, almost 1.5%. You go ahead, take the rest. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Great to see you. My obeisances to all the devotees. It is Ramananda Roy's Avir Bhav. It's his appearance day. And so I've been asked to speak about him. And automatically, as a Gaudiya Vaishnava, when we think about Ram Anand Roy, we think about the Chaitanya Charitamrita, the magnum opus of Gaudiya literature, where all the conclusions of our Granth Acharyas and all the conclusions of the Vaishnava followers of Mahaprabhu are distilled and summarized in a really beautiful way, where Siddhanta meets Leela. And so what you get in the Chaitanya Charitamrita is you get the Leelas, the sacred narrations, which became the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. And so you have a book like the Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, or the Logu Bhagavatamrita, or Ujjvala Nilamani. You have these Gaudiya Granthas where our philosophy is laid out, even the Sandarbhas themselves. And you find that those books were the result of people associating with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. They sat with him and they heard from him. They were inspired by him. And that gave rise to the Gaudiya tradition as we know it. So there was a conversation that took place between Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Ramananda Roy on the banks of the Godavari River next to Rajmundry.
I'll bring your phone. You want to sign on from here?
No,
Or you want to be inside? It's a
no,
good.
no.
Jata, Dhruva, please mute yourselves.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
There was a conversation between Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, a series of conversations that took place on the bank of the Godavari River, just outside of Rajmundry, where Ramananda Roy was serving as governor for Prataparudra Maharaj. And this represents sort of the southern part of the kingdom of Maharaj Prataparudra. The Godavari River is a super famous river in India. We sing that song, or we chant that mantra, Gange cha Yamuna chaiva, Godavari Saraswati, Narmada Sindhu Kaveri Jalasmin Sadidhim Kuru, where we call the sacred rivers when we're making Achman. And the Godavari is listed just after the Ganga and the Yamuna, even before the Saraswati. I think that's probably for metrical reasons as much as for philosophical ones, but it's the second longest river in India, second only to the Ganga, and it goes across about 1,500 kilometers from the western mountains of Maharashtra, dumping into the Bay of Bengal in Odisha. And so Rajmundry was a capital that Ramananda Roy was serving as the governor at. It's in Rajmundry is in, I just said it, Odisha, and why am I forgetting the state? Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, excuse me. It's in Andhra Pradesh. And so Mahaprabhu, as he was beginning to tour in the south, he had been told by Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, go and meet Ramananda Roy. And so Chaitanya Mahaprabhu went and met him. And Ramananda Roy was a Shudra, but he was a Roy, which is just like the Rajputs were technically farmers and Shudras. And even the term Rajput indicates this. They're the Rajputra. They're the sons of kings. And so they were Shudras and farmers, and not all farmers are Vaishyas. Landed farmers were Vaishyas. Landless farmers were Shudras. But they got swept up, much like the Jat kings in North India, into various military campaigns, and they ended up becoming rulers. So like Kushum Sarovar, that was built in honor of Suraj Mal, the Jat king, and the Jats and the Rajputs were various Vaishya and Shudra castes of farmers who took up arms in times of conflict over the last 1,000 years or so, and gradually uplifted their caste designation until they became Kshatriyas. And so Ram Anand Roy was also from this lower Shudra caste, but the title Roy meant that he occupied a very high place in the government. And so just like in northern India, Rajput is a respectable name, although traditionally it wasn't a Kshatriya name. It became so during the Mughal period or just before. Similarly, the Roys were titles that were granted to people who, although they may have engaged in government ministerial services, they may have engaged in occupations which were suitable for Shudras, they were elevated. So anyway, Ramananda Roy shows up at the Godavari River to take bath with a whole entourage, with a bunch of brahmanas chanting Vedic verses on a palanquin, and goes to formally take his bath with all this pomp and circumstance. And he sees Mahaprabhu, who's there. And Mahaprabhu doesn't say anything. He's just waiting patiently. But he knows who Ramananda Roy is, and Mahaprabhu feels very attracted to him. And of course, Ramananda Roy is Vishaka Devi in Krishna Lila. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is Radha Bhavadyuti Suvalitam. He's adorned with the sentiments and complexion of Radharani. And also, anyway, so they have obviously a very intimate connection in that world. And so Chaitanya Mahaprabhu saw him but didn't say anything. And then Ramananda Roy saw Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and came running over and offered obeisances. And they exchanged niceties and formalities. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya told me to come and meet you. And Ramananda Roy said, that's my good fortune. I'm so fallen. I'm a Shudra. And just see, you are the Supreme Personality of God, that you don't care for these caste distinctions. You're above all of them. And so you haven't even hesitated to embrace me, a Shudra who's fallen at your feet. And the Brahmanas who were watching this were bewildered. They were thinking, why is this sannyasi, this effulgent sannyasi, crying and behaving like a bhavuka, like an emotional person around Ramananda Roy? And why is the respectable Roy, who's the governor of our entire area, falling on the ground and making a fool of himself? And so they were bewildered. They couldn't understand it. Mahaprabhu and Ramananda Roy exchanged greetings and niceties and warmth, and then they sat down and began to discuss and meet. Over a period of days, they came together several times and had several seminal discussions about everything that has to do with Krishna consciousness. So much so that the Ramananda Sambad, the 8th chapter of the Madhya Lila, is called Sadhana Sadhya Tattva, the truth of the goal and the means. Sadhana Sadhya Tattva. And so the means and the goal, the truth about the means and the goal of life. And in fact, that comes up in the chapter itself. So they met, they made an arrangement to sit down together and meet. They got back together and they met on the banks of the river. They sat together and they talked about a number of things. Mahaprabhu started out the conversation by saying, Pada shloka, sadhyera nirnoy. Speak one shloka about the that ascertains the goal of life. Speak one shloka that ascertains the goal of life. And Ramananda Roy said, swadharma anucharana Vishnu bhakti hoy, that you should do your swadharma, your varnashram dharma, for the pleasure of Vishnu, so that Vishnu bhakti arises in your heart. This was his opening gambit, his first answer. And he quotes from the Bhagavatam to support his point of view. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's reaction was, Eho bahya, age kaha ar. Eho bahya, this is external. Age kaha ar. Proceed to speak something more. So Mahaprabhu rejected his first answer, and this became something of a formula for their conversation. Ram Anand Roy would present a potential answer to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's question, and Mahaprabhu would reject it. Eho bahya, this is external. Age, proceed. Kaha ar, speak more. In other words, move past that. That's external. That's not the sadhya vastu of life. That's not the substantive goal of life. You failed my question. Mahaprabhu indicated that the answer was not going to come easy. And so verses like, Atapum Birdvija Shrestha Varnashrama Vibhagasa, verses like that normally are quoted by devotees from our sacred literature to establish Siddhanta. These very verses from Gita, from Bhagavad, were, for all intents and purposes, rejected as external by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So then Ram Anand Roy's next argument was karmarpana, that to offer all of your karma as an offering to Vishnu is the goal of life. And he quotes the Gita, Yat Karoshi Yadashnasi. He quotes that verse in the Gita to substantiate this point. So that was number 2. And so Krishna Karma Arpana, that is the sadhya, the goal of life. And Mahaprabhu again, Eho Bahya, rejecting now verses from Bhagavat and verses from Gita. And then Ramananda proceeds further. Swadharma Tyaga, give up all dharma. That's the goal of life. And he quotes the Gita again, sarva dharman prityajya, that you should give up all dharma. And Mahaprabhu again, eho bahya, age kahar. That's external. Speak something more. Then he says, jnana mishra bhakti. Bhakti mixed with knowledge. Brahmabhuta, prasanatma, na shochati, na kankshati. Mahaprabhu again, eho bahya, age kahar. That's external. Something more. Then he says, jnana shunya bhakti. That bhakti devoid of jnana. And then Mahaprabhu says, eho hoy. That's okay. So after, half a dozen rounds, finally they arrive at something that Mahaprabhu will accept. But even then he says, eho hoy, that's okay. That's all right. Age kahar, you speak something more. And then he continues. So the baseline of their discussion, the beginning point of their discussion is to reject Varnashram, which is exemplified by Mahaprabhu, who embraced Ramananda Roy, even though he was a Shudra. In fact, that verse, Kiba Vipra Kiba Nyasi Shudra Kene Noy, E Krishna Tattva Beti Se Guru Hoy. That verse is there in this chapter. That a sannyasi, Kiba Vipra, why not a sannyasi? Oh, even a sannyasi, Kiba Vipra, even a Brahman, even a sannyasi, why not a Shudra? Shudra Kene Noy, why not a Shudra? E Krishna Tattva Beti, one who knows the science of Krishna, She Guru Hoy, he is Guru. And so Mahaprabhu exemplified this by the way he dealt with Ramananda Roy and Rup Sanatan and so many others for that matter. Haridas Thakur became our Nam Acharya, the Acharya, of course, being the formal head of an institution or a mission, a very respectable term, one of the most respectable terms. He was chosen for the Shraddha Patra of Advaita Acharya, the most respectable Brahmana. He gave that to Haridas Thakur. And so this was a major starting point of their discussion, was the rejection of Varnashram, and then the rejection even of Krishna Karmarpana, of offering all your activities to Krishna, Sarva Dharma Tyag, to give up all Dharma, Jnana Mishra Bhakti, quoting Brahmabhuta Prasanatma, and then finally Jnana Shunya Bhakti. That was finally acceptable. Interestingly, Prabhupada mirrors this. Prabhupada translated a book. He translated this conversation before he came to the West, In Search of the Ultimate Goal of Life. It was a translation of the Ramananda Samvad. It never got published by ISKCON. It was discovered or rediscovered or picked up by Jagat Guru Swami, who became Narasimha Maharaj, and it was published. My guess is in the early 90s. It became published, In Search of the Ultimate Goal of Life, which is Prabhupada's paraphrasing and rendering and synopsizing the Ramananda Samvad, this very chapter.
Available at Ras Bihari Lal and Sons.
100% it's available there. Yeah, I don't know where else it's available. For sure it'll be Ras Bihari Lal. And so, even in Prabhupada's purport to the verse, Sarva Dharma Prityajya, he says, I'm just reading it here, the Lord has described various kinds of knowledge and process of religion, including the different types of orders and statuses of social life, knowledge of the renounced order of life, etc., etc. The Lord now says that Arjuna should give up all these processes. One should simply accept religious principles that will lead to devotional service. One may perform a particular occupational duty according to his position in the social order, but if that does not come to the point of Krishna consciousness, all his activities are in vain. I'm reading directly from Prabhupada's purport. So you see Prabhupada honoring this interpretation of Sarva Dharman Pari. Pari means completely. Tyajya, you must give up all Dharma completely. It's interpreted by Prabhupada and our commentators in general as referring to Varnashram Dharma. And you find that honored in this section of the Chaitanya Charitamrita And in the Gaudiya commentaries to it, and also in our commentaries to all the verses about Varnashram, ultimately, they get a treatment like this. That, of course, leads you to wonder, what does it mean when Prabhupada said, half my mission's undone? I came to set up Varnashram. And that's a conversation for another day. But that's how I began when I was asked to lecture on Varnashram. I said, as Gaudiyas, we have to start the conversation of implementing Varnashram by acknowledging that our tradition has a love-hate relationship with Varnashram. And that philosophically, we reject Varnashram as being external. And I quoted from this very section. And from Prabhupada's purports to In Search of the Ultimate Goal of Life, and to the Gita, and to this chapter, because that's where some of the most strong criticisms of Varnashram are located. And so Prabhupada's introduction of Varnashram in a attenuated way, and his desire for his disciples to expand on it with the growth of the movement, has to be juxtapositioned with the statements of the same Srila Prabhupada, offering a standard, time-honored, and normative Gaudiya critique of Varnashram. And those two things have to be juxtapositioned, and you have to, do a dexterous dance between them and walk that razor's edge. Otherwise, you end up with an Ardha Kukuti Nyaya, a half-end logic, where you're ignoring a major part of Prabhupada's teachings. And so anyway, you see that honored here. And it goes further. It goes, like I said, it goes on to Jnana, Mishra Bhakti, and even giving up all Dharma. Even that is not enough for Mahaprabhu to say, Eho Hoy, this is okay. Even saying Sarva Dharma Priya, which is a rejection of Varnashram, according to Srila Prabhupada and all of our acharyas, even that's not enough to move the needle of Mahaprabhu and get him to get off of his soapbox. And this chapter begins with a beautiful verse, almost like a samsara, dava anala lidha loka, where it says that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is an ocean and Ramananda Roy is a cloud that took those teachings from the ocean of Mahaprabhu's mercy and then sprinkled them back down. And so that acknowledgement that this is all coming from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, even though it was spoken in a question and answer format, almost like an Upanishadic format, that's acknowledged in the beginning of the chapter, that Mahaprabhu himself was the source of this knowledge. So anyway, they get to this Eho Hoy, Age Kahar, that's okay, that's all right, but you speak something more. And then he goes through Dasya, Sakya, Vatsalya, and Shringar Rati, the four primary relationships with Krishna. And Mahaprabhu keeps saying at each stage, he's Eho, Eho Hoy, Eho Uttama, that's first class. Age Kahar, Age Kichuar, there's something more, something a little more. A little more you can say, Age Kichuar, can you say a little more? Eho Uttama, it's very good. It's not just all right, it's very good, but can you speak more? And then finally, he says Shringar Rati, Madhurya Rati, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says Eho Uttam. He says, okay, this is good. Sadhya Avadhi, Age Kichuar, this is the limit. Sadhya Avadhi, this is the limit of the goal of life. Age Kichuar, can you speak more? Can you say something further? And then he asks him, you please teach me. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu asks him, please teach me Krishner Tattva, Radhara Tattva, the truth of Krishna, the truth of Radharani, Rasa Tattva, Prem Tattva. You please teach me all these things. And Ramananda Roy goes through and speaks verses about Krishna, verses about Radharani, verses about Rasa, verses about Prem. And they form the core of our tradition's understanding of these topics. And in many ways, you can say that, the writings of Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, directly derived from this Siddhanta that was spoken on this day between Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Ramananda Roy. In fact, so many verses, so many ideas that are encoded in our literature come from this conversation. So much of Swarup Damodar's understanding of Mahaprabhu is also mirrored exactly in the Ramananda Samvad, and core tenets of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Ujjvala, Nilamani, Brihad Bhagavatamrita, Laghu Bhagavatamrita, the Sandarbhas, etc., etc. It's here in a crystallized, in a synopsized, in a lila, and it then became a Siddhanta. But it came from this living conversation between the Lord and his devotee. Bhaktivinoda Thakur addresses this, and he says, these verses, they're sometimes spoken by Mahaprabhu. They're in our later Gaudiya literature. It's not that they're being rewritten into the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Rather, these were verses spoken by the Lord himself, which were recorded and then put into our Gaudiya literature. He actually deals with this potential objection in his Amrita Pravaha commentary on the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Okay, so at least I think that's the name of his commentary. I'm drawing a blank. I'm pretty sure that's it. I'll double check afterwards. I don't want to stop now. To give you an idea of kind of the flavor of their conversation, I thought I would just read directly from Prabhupada's Chaitanya Charitamrita, a few verses. Srimati Radharani's is the topmost spiritual gem. Her transcendental body is brilliant in luster and full of all transcendental fragrance. Lord Krishna's affection for her is like a perfumed massage. Krishna's love is being likened to a perfumed massage of Radharani. His love for her is massaging her, embracing her. Radharani takes her first bath in the shower of the nectar of compassion. She takes her second bath in the nectar of youth. Her midday bath is in the nectar of bodily luster. And then she puts on the garment of shyness, which is her dark silk sari. Here said, translates her black silk sari. Sham can mean black, it can mean blue. Nila is blue, Nilambara, black or blue. Radharani's affection for Krishna is her upper garment, which is pinkish in color. She then covers her breast with another garment composed of affection and anger towards Krishna. Her personal beauty is the reddish kumkum powder on her body. Her affection for her associates is sandalwood pulp, and the sweetness of her smile is camphor. All these combined together are smeared all over her body. Conjugal love for Krishna is an abundance of musk, and with that musk, her whole body is decorated. Craftiness and covered anger constitute the arrangement of her hair. The quality of anger due to jealousy is the silk garment covering her body. Her attachment for Krishna is the reddish color of betel nuts on her brilliant lips. Her double dealings in loving affairs constitute the black ointment of kajal around her eyes. The ornaments decorating her body are the blazing ecstasies of goodness and constantly existing ecstasies headed by jubilation, etc., etc. Her tilak of good fortune. Her tilak is her good fortune. Her various loving affairs are a gem. Her heart is a locket, etc., etc., etc. So you get this beautiful description, this beautiful poetic description of Radharani as being adorned with all of the critical features that separate her from all the other gopis. When Mahaprabhu said to him, Sarva Sadhya Avadi, this is the highest limit of all goals of life. Age ki chuar, he said, speak something more. Ramananda said, you want me to speak something more? Radharani's love within Shringarati. Radha Kund, of all places you can go to, forming the basis of Rupa Goswami's love for Radha Kund. That is something more I can speak on Shringarati, on the ultimate goal of life. And Mahaprabhu said, and you tell me something more about Radharani. You tell me something more about Krishna. And then he speaks like this to communicate what can only be communicated through poetry. And how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. At some point, if you want to really understand Radha and Krishna's love, you have to read poetry. That gets you the closest, because their love is ultimately poetic. That's why the Bhagavatam uses so many poetic meters. That's why Lalita and Vidagdha Madhava were written. That's why our Gaudiya Acharyas write plays when they want to describe some very, very high Siddhanta, very, very high Tattva. They'll write a play. They'll write poetry. And so Ramananda Roy was the one who inspected Rupa Goswami's poetry. When Rupa Goswami wrote Lalitam Vidagdamadav in Until 1, Ramananda Roy was chosen to inspect it. He looked it over and said, okay, this is good poetry. He was the Kaviraj. He was the Pandit. His love for Krishna was unparalleled. He was the elder in a relationship with Rupa Goswami. And so he speaks verses like this that take us just to a very, very deep place. And then Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, okay, you told me the sadhya, now I want the sadhana. How do I get there? How do I get that conjugal love that Radharani has? How do I get to that level? There's one more thing that happens. At some point, Mahaprabhu asks you, tell me something more. After Radharani is described in this way, in this poetic way. And Ramananda Roy says, there's no book. I have only my own poetry. They get to a place where there's no book left for Ramananda Roy to quote. He has to quote his own poetry. And he says, I've written poetry called Prem Vilas Vivarta, the bewilderment due to the pastimes of love. And in there, he is a pure, cryptic, poetic description of the nature of love and the naturalness of love and separation and madness in separation and sweetness. And Mahaprabhu says, okay, that's it. Now you tell me how to get it. So just to recap, they meet together. Mahaprabhu breaks social convention. He's asked, what's the goal of life? And he says, yeah, Swadharma Acharana Vishnu Bhakti Hoy. You do your Swadharma to get Vishnu Bhakti. Varnashram. Quotes the verses from the Bhagavatam. Mahaprabhu rejects it. Tells him Krishna Karma Arpana. Offer all your activities to Krishna. Quotes the Gita. Yakuroshi Dasana. Krishna rejects it. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu rejects it. And then he says to him, Sarvadharma Tyag. Give up all Dharma. Mahaprabhu rejects it. Sarvadharma Parija. He rejects that also. Jnana Mishra Bhakti, Brahma Bhuta Prasnama. He rejects that. Jnana Shula Bhakti. Bhakti devoid of Jnana. Mahaprabhu says, okay, that's okay. Tell me more. Dasya, Sakya, Vatsadya, Prem. Finally, Mahaprabhu says, that is the goal. But you tell me something more. Radha Kund, Radharani. You tell me about Radharani. Then he tells about Radharani in this beautiful poetic way. Mahaprabhu says, tell me something more. Ramananda says, I have nothing more. No one's ever asked me this before. I have my own writing. Prem Vilas Vivarta. And Mahaprabhu is fully satisfied. Then he says, now you tell me how to get it. And then Ramananda Roy says, Rag Anuga Bhakti. Gopi Anugatya. Gopi Bhav, Kodi Angikar. You have to accept the sentiments of the gopis. You have to follow the gopis. And he lays out our traditions, treatment of Raga Anuga Bhakti. And ultimately you fall in love with Krishna's associates. And you follow in the wake of their devotion. And that represents Upadesh Sar, the Upadesh Amrit. There's a verse in the Upadesh Amrit. Tishtan Braje Tad Anuragi Jananugami. That you reside in Vrindavan, you follow in the footsteps of resident Vrindavan, and that is Upadesha Saram, the essence of all advice. And the Upadesh Amrit, the nectar of Upadesh, the Upadesh Sar, the essence of all Upadesh is this. And that's taught by Ramananda Roy. And so this is Sadhya, Sadhana Tattva. Ram Anand Samvad. In search of the ultimate goal of life. The means and the ends. The goal of life and the way to get there. And our whole Gaudiya tradition is fleshed out. Ultimately leading to poetry, which is what our Gaudiyas do when they want to really get deep. What Ramananda Roy did, what Mahaprabhu did. They all read poetry. Mahaprabhu himself recited that poetry, Yakumara Hara, at the Rath Yatra. No one could understand. It's a verse from Sanskrit erotic poetry. And then Rupa Goswami reworked it into Priyo Soham, the verse about Radha and Krishna. Mahaprabhu slapped him and said, "Oh, you've understood me. You understood what I was doing. I was using poetry. I was using." That's why that's why we talk about bhakti as ras. The rasa shastras are the books about dramaturgy. They're how to write a good drama, not based on a plot-based model like Greek tragedy, like Greek poetry, like what every cinema has done, but based on a rasa theory, the idea that the purpose of poetry, the purpose of drama, the purpose of dance is to evoke a particular sentiment in the part of your audience. That's why, Indian dance is so poor from a physical point of view. But where do they hear their facial expressions, their eyes, the way they look at each other, the sentiments communicated by the doors to the soul? That's what makes everybody cry. And so this rasa theory in the rasa shastras, in the natya shastras, in the work of Bharad Muni, got reworked. That's why we call it Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu. That rasa is coming from those rasa granthas, those books which are about dramaturgy, and this idea, this poetic idea, these poetic meters, the usage of poetic devices and alliteration and drama is how we communicate our deepest truths, and that's what Ramananda Roy did with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Then how do you get it? And then you have a sadhana, rag anuga sadhana, gopi anugatya. You follow the gopis. Gopa bhava kodi angikar. You accept the sentiments of the gopis. And that's our tradition's voice on this topic, universally, uniformly. Srila Prabhupada's teachings. You read his translation of the Upadesh Amrit. You read his purport to that verse. He goes through all of this stuff. It's there. It might not be on every page of our tradition, but it's certainly there in our tradition. It's there in these verses. But remember, Prabhupada's translation of these verses is also his Siddhanta. It's also his books. Not that we skip over this for a letter or this or that. We also have to look at these primary literatures. And so then after that, we can stop there for a second. I've been going for a little while now, at least half an hour, something like that, maybe a little longer. We could call that part one of the discussion. Does somebody want to jump in? I can't see anybody's faces. You guys have all blacked yourselves out, so I'm the only one up on the screen. But I'd love to hear some feedback.
Devotees?
That's either really good or really bad, right? Either left them speechless or they've all gone to eat dinner or something like that.
I think it's really good.
I could contribute a few words, I suppose. First of all, I'm delighted to hear this discourse. Really, really relishable, very, very nice. And I feel that it's particularly important at present because my perception lately has been that I think a lot of devotees get really hung up on some of the details of Varnashram and fail to understand its actual position relatively in our philosophy. So there's that. I'd love to hear about Ramananda Roy, extraordinary personality. But this issue of Varnashram has been a point of contention for many years. There's been a lot of discussion from all different angles, and many people asserting that it's very important that we establish Varnashram. I'll tell you that I once heard Srila Prabhupada talking about Varnashram, and he said that as Vaishnavas, we have nothing to do with Varnashram, that our interest in reestablishing Varnashram is not for ourselves, it's actually for society at large. just for the organization of society at large, and to direct people gradually towards advancement, advancement towards Krishna consciousness. But for the devotees, we have nothing to do with Varnashram. It's a practical way to organize our lives, but it's not something it's not our central focus. It's not. It's just not primary. It's a secondary and as you say, an external issue. So those are some things I could contribute. I thank you very much for a wonderful discussion of Ramananda Roy, some of his history and his interactions with Lord Chaitanya, replete with lots and lots of wonderful quotations. It's been delightful. It was very nice to hear some of the wonderful descriptions of Srimati Radharani. This has been a real treat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taka Prabhu. I'm real honored that you listened to my discourse. Your words are very, very kind. We'll get to you in just a second, Vinod. But thank you very much for what you said. And I think that what you offered, that Varnashram is for organizing society and not necessarily just for the devotees. I think that is a good standard, typical resolution of how Prabhupada simultaneously glorified and criticized Varnashram. I think that's probably the first and most important resolution to, some kind of a paradox where why is Prabhupada apparently contradicting himself? And I think what you said, that it's mainly for the others that you heard it from directly from Prabhupada, I think that represents the primary resolution to the differing statements. There's some room for a little nuance. Prabhupada was talking to Satsvarup Maharaj in Mayapur, and Satsvarup Maharaj was saying, we have nothing to do with Varnashram. And Prabhupada said, being a Vaishnava is not such an easy thing. If you're a Vaishnava, then why are you falling down? Better become a Brahmana first. So sometimes he would chide his disciples who were becoming fallen for not being learned enough, for dismissing their studies as being somehow lower. And he would tell them that first become a Brahmana, then become a Vaishnava. There were statements like that. But even those statements, I think they really just nuance what you said as opposed to replace it. They become a small accoutrement to the main primary resolution, which is what you described. And so I appreciate that very much. The fact you heard it from Prabhupada makes it all the sweeter for me. And I was remembering one thing, just, at one point they say, this is direct from the, Ramananda Roy says, Ratri Dina Chinte Radha Krishna Bihar. Ratri Dina Chinte. Day and night, you think about what? Radha Krishna Bihar. Radha and Krishna's pastimes. And so that this thing that comes up again in our Gaudiya tradition, that Radha and Krishna's pastimes are the ultimate goal of life, that we want to go back to the Ras Leela, that we want to go back to Vrindavan, that we want to join Krishna's family in Vrindavan, that we want to develop love for Krishna's associates. That's not just even love for Radharani, but rather love for Radharani's gopis. That sets up Manjari Bhav. There's a setup for Manjari Bhav in this chapter. It gets fleshed out later on, but at least the core setup for Manjari Bhav is in this chapter, that we're following the footsteps of the gopis, that we're following in their wake, that we're serving them. And so that, anyway, I felt inspired to say that also as a critical point, just like the critical point you made about Varnashram, just to keep with the theme of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Ramananda Roy's discussion. And then it was Vinod, you were going to say something. So thank you again, Prabhu. I'm really honored that you listened to my class and that you spoke in appreciation of it. I feel encouraged by that. And also I appreciate very much the resolution you offered to the, quote unquote paradox of why Prabhupada simultaneously had a love and hate relationship with Varnashram Dharma. I think your resolution is the resolution, and everything else becomes some kind of masala or some kind of bell and whistle to that primary one. Vinodji?
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Thank you. I have two questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
One One might be somewhat short. First question is why, I've always wondered why Ramananda Roy, Lord Chaitanya was not hesitant to, associate intimately with Ramananda Roy, who was also a government person, but with, King Prataparudra, he was like, it took so much effort just for him to get, a little bit of time with him.
I think that's a great question. There is no specific resolution to that. I can guess at it. It's not like there's a verse in our Shastra which answers that, but I think I got some good answers that came to mind as you were speaking. Number one is Ramananda Roy is Vishaka. Maharaj Prataparudra isn't. He's like Maharaj Indrajumna reincarnated or something like that. But, so Maharaj Prataparudra isn't, as a result of being a part. Oh, by the way, I'm assuming Taraka Prabhu was Prabhupada's disciple, but I was just also thinking that Prabhupada himself got really into doing plays. Advent of the Age of Kali. Prabhupada himself was into these plays as part of our preaching. And Vishnu John Swami, when he was in Los Angeles, I think it was 1970 or something like that, they would practice a play all week long and then do the play as part of the Sunday feast. And at one point they did Chaitanya Mahaprabhu picking the mangoes and giving them to all the devotees. And they did that pastime, and they bought boxes of mangoes. And at that point, they passed out mangoes to everyone in the entire audience. And they would do a different play every week. And that was a major part of our presentation. It was, we were attempting, it was a cultural presentation. And so this, it might not have been, we might not have been doling out the most esoteric of Siddhantas we had, and Rasa Tattva and all that for Sunday feast guests. But this principle of a cultural presentation, as mentioned in Prabhupada's introduction to the Bhagavatam, by his own writing of plays himself, like Advent of the Age of Kali, and by his disciples putting on plays as a regular part of the early Krishna conscious movement, interactive plays, which were designed to pull the audience in vicariously and let them participate in something greater than themselves. That still was very much a part of the early Hare Krishna movement. Our Sankirtan processions, in many ways, are a dramatic performance. Everybody dressed appropriately and with music and dancing. It's very cultural, very rich, very thick, very tasty. And so I just thought of that. But anyway, Ram Anand Roy was Vishaka. He was super intimate. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was ordered by Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, the super Brahmin Pandit of Puri, practically the co-author of the Navya Nyaya philosophy, to go and speak with Ramananda Roy. Ramananda Roy was out in Rajmundry, out in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't in the middle of Puri. He was going to get in a lot of trouble. He was a small governor instead of a big king, so we could skip over that and not make a big deal out of it. And Mahaprabhu would, eat in the homes of brahmanas who had to also be lakshapatis, who had to also chant 100,000 names a day. And he embraced Haridas Thakur and performed his Shrad ceremony. And so Mahaprabhu also had a love-hate relationship with Varnashram, as did our acharyas. Gopal Bhatt Goswami initiated everybody. Rup Sanatan did not initiate anybody except for Jeev, and Jeev didn't initiate anybody. Gopal Bhatt Goswami, big pundits, not from, hadn't mixed so much with the Malechas like Rup Sanatan had. He became the guru for all the Gaudiyas. But then a generation later, Narottam Das Thakur, also from a Shudra Varna. From Prabhupada's, it was kind of like a Shudra Kshatriya type caste, again, like the Roys, and so he was, Narottam Das Thakur began initiating, even Brahmanas, and getting in trouble for it. And if you read Narottam Vilas, it's just stories about Brahmanas getting upset that Narottam was fully implementing the Gaudiya philosophy. In the beginning, the ideas were there, that even a Shudra. But, Haridas Thakur did not become guru, giving Diksha. And so some honoring of the social structure was there, but then chipping away at it was also there. And then eventually, Akayasta, became, in the form of Narottam Das Thakur, became an acharya and initiated everybody. And so you see that love-hate relationship with Varnashram in Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's life, in the lives of his followers, where they're pushing and pulling and acquiescing and also challenging. And so Mahaprabhu also did that. And so with Ramananda Roy there, he couldn't stop himself. He was like, it was Vishaka, couldn't stop himself. It had to happen. And it was out in the middle of nowhere by the bank of a river. Not everybody could see. It wasn't the big king. It was a smaller king. And anyway, Mahaprabhu flew in the face of convention in many ways, while at the same time honoring it on some level. Also, eventually, Ramananda Roy, as a result of Mahaprabhu's association, retired from his government service with a full pension and just went and spent time in Puri with Mahaprabhu. So the result of their interaction was they made plans to get together in Puri and for Ramananda Roy to retire completely, which he did, and was honored with a full pension. And so he caught Ramananda Roy at the end of his tenure instead of right in the thick of it. Do any of those answers satisfy you?
Yeah, very much. All of them. Very good. Thank you.
I think it was a good question, and those things just immediately a lot of answers came to my mind, and I feel as I'm listening to myself talk, I'm thinking, yeah, those sound very, very reasonable and incongruent with our tradition, incongruent with other things we see, and incongruent with the way our tradition deals with, and amazingly, it's very much that love-hate relationship that Prabhupada himself also displayed, where on some level. And yeah, actually, Mahaprabhu eventually showed himself as Ramananda Roy said, "I see you as a sannyasi, but now I see you as Krishna, and now I see you as a golden doll. What's going on?" Mahaprabhu says, "I'm Radha and Krishna," and shows him. And Ramananda Roy faints, and Mahaprabhu touches him and revives him and says, "Shh, don't tell anybody. I've never shown." It's like a Vishwarup Darshan, but for a Gaudiya. He's like, "I've never shown this form to anybody. Nobody's seen this form but you. Don't tell anyone." There's a whole exchange. He says, "I see you as Krishna. I see you as a golden." Mahaprabhu says, "You're a Mahabhagavad. You see everybody as Krishna." He goes, "No, don't cheat me. Don't lie to me." The Mahaprabhu says, "Here I am." Then he faints. He brings him back to life, and he says, "Shh." And so there was some secret that was being done here, not for everybody. And it was like a Vishwarup Darshan from the Gita, but a super purified version of it. Question number 2.
Okay, second question is if you could just share or explain some of the significance of Mahaprabhu saying that this is okay at that one point in the dialogue.
Yeah, right. There's a number of things. He says, "Eho bahya," this is external. "Eho hoy," this is all right. "Eho uttam," this is first class. And then "age kahar," you speak something more. And then "age kichwa," just give me a little bit more, just a little bit more. And so eventually Mahaprabhu says, "Okay, that's it. Nothing more can be said." Mahaprabhu himself even acknowledges that. And so what you've got is Gyan Shunya Bhakti is like the bare minimum of Uttam Bhakti. Right? Anya Abhilasita Shunyam, characteristically devoid of any other desire. Jnana Karmadi Anavritam, not covered by jnana or karma. Anukulyena Shishya, Anukulyena Krishnanushilanam Bhakti Uttam. This is first class devotion. This is Rupa Goswami's own definition of bhakti, building on the Sarvopadi Vinirmuktam Tatparatvaina Nirmalam of the Pancharatra literature. We're building on that, and then Rupa Goswami is making it very definitive. And so that jnana karmadi anavritam, not covered by jnana or karma. So jnana shunya bhakti. In some ways, you could say that the whole idea of swadharma acharan Vishnu bhakti, hoy, that to do your swadharma for the pleasure of the Lord, or karmarpana, to offer your actions for the pleasure of the Lord, or sarva dharman prichajya, to give up all dharma. All of that would be included in karma mishra bhakti. It's not stated. Those words aren't used in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, but they are used by our acharyas. Karma mishra bhakti. You think you have something to give up. You think something belongs to you. So Mahaprabhu rejected Karma Mishra Bhakti in 3 forms, and then Jnana Mishra Bhakti, which is directly stated. And so I feel confident in saying these are Karma Mishra Bhakti because Jnana Mishra Bhakti is stated here, and all these things are saying Karma Arpana and Swadharma. And so they're saying you do your dharma, you do your karma, and you offer that. So that's Karma Mishra Bhakti, Jnana Mishra Bhakti. To get rid of the mixing of bhakti with those 2 things, then it's Uttam Bhakti. And that's the boilerplate. And what form does that take? Dasya, Sakya, Vatsalya, and Shringar, Madhurya. And those are bhakti proper. Even in the spiritual, even in Vaikuntha, those are bhakti proper. So that's okay. What's more? Vrindavan, Radharani. You know, Mahaprabhu says, Aishwarya Shitila Prem Nahimra Prita. Prem weakened by our Aishwarya does not attract me. Ultimately, Krishna is most attracted by pure love, by the love of the residents of Vrindavan. This is another massive trope of Gaudiya literature, of our tradition. And so you have Karma Mishra Bhakti, Jnana Mishra Bhakti. You have to get rid of those. You have to do pure bhakti. Pure bhakti could be in Vaikuntha or Golok. Dasya's there in Vaikuntha. But then higher is Braj Prem, Radharani, Radha Kund, Shringarati. That's the highest thing. Then give me a little something more. Here's some poetry about it. Prem Vivarta. Vipralamba really is what's described there. Separation. And that was satisfying to the Lord, who then moved on and asked about other things, showing that the conversation was naturally done. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Good question. Good question.
I have some,
or we
I
can,
have-
yeah, please.
something for you. You mentioned Ramananda Roy being Vishaka, but that's actually Bhaktivinoda Thakur's conclusion. According to the Gauraganadesh Deepika, there are 2 Arjunas in Krishna Lila. One is Priya Narmasaka in Vraja, and the other one is the Pandavas Arjuna. These 2 combined to become Mahaprabhu's dear companion Ramananda Roy. Ramananda was very knowledgeable in the teachings of loving devotion to Radha and Krishna, which he described to Gaurachandra on a daily basis. Some say that Ramananda Roy was Lalita Saki, but others do not. Mahaprabhu himself told Bhavananda Roy that he was Pandu, the husband of Kunti and father of the Pandavas. The Pandav Arjuna also united with the gopi named Arjuniya. Thus, the most aware say that Ramananda Roy combined all these 3 personalities. Proof of this is found in the Padma Purana, where it is stated that the Pandav Arjuna became the gopi Aruniya. This is the Gauraganadesh Deepika, 120, 124. Of course, Bhaktivinoda Thakur said, he wrote, the love that awakened in Ramananda and Mahaprabhu when they met was the same as the love that Vishaka had for Radha and Krishna in Braj, and that which Radha and Krishna had for Vishaka. Thus, it is clear that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur saw Ramananda Roy as Vishaka. Ramananda Roy was one of the Lord's 3.5 most intimate associates. I don't know if you want to talk about it. I have something for you.
Comment on that?
You want to comment on it?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, go ahead.
To start with, you have multiple people in manifesting in one person Chaitanya Lila. And if you want to understand which of those personalities is most appropriate for a given pastime, you have to look at the mood that the Lord is manifesting in that pastime. And so if we look at the mood that the Lord was manifesting in that pastime with Ramananda Roy, he was in the mood of Radharani. So Ramananda Roy is Krishna's best friend and Radharani's best friend. And so you have Arjuna, Arjuna Gopa, and Arjuniya Gopi, Lalita and Vishaka. Now, generally, Lalita Devi is identified with Gadadhar Pandit in Gaur Leela. In the Gorganadish Deepika, it specifically mentions she's Radharani and also Lalita. So I usually like to leave Lalita for Gadadhar Pandit, which leaves Vishaka for Ramanand Roy. Now I know Prabhupada wrote that in his purport, but I think you were reading from his purport. Were you reading from his purport, or were you reading from the Gorganadish Deepika?
I was reading from a Gorganadesh Deepika.
Okay, so but then where did you get this thing about Bhaktivinoda Thakur?
This is written in this book, which is written by, I'm sure you're familiar.
I don't know it. No.
This is from a Gaudiya Mat, printed by Mandala Press by Swami B.V. Tirtha. But the
Associates, right?
what's that?
The Lord's Associates, right?
Yes,
Got it. Hold on one second.
Bhakti Vallabha Tirtha Maharaj.
Yeah. He wrote that. It's a beautiful book on all the Lord's Associates, right?
Yeah, that's correct. He's quoting, so I imagine he's not putting his opinion. It's just he basically in between quotes from Goraganadesh Deepika and from Bhaktivinoda Thakur.
Yeah. So here's Srila Prabhupada. Ramananda Roy was an incarnation of Vishaka. This is in this chapter. It's directly stated by Prabhupada. Sri Ramananda Roy was an incarnation of the Gopi Vishaka. It's his purport to CC Madhya 823, this chapter.
Mhm.
Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was Lord Krishna himself. There was a natural awakening of love between Vishaka and Krishna. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was a combination of Srimati Radharani and Krishna, and the Gopi Vishaka is a principal Gopi assisting Srimati Radharani. Thus, the natural love between Ramananda Roy and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu awakened and they embraced. So, you know, I would want to look at the Gorganadish Deepika closely. I have it. I don't want to pull it out. It'll take too long. It'll break us up. But certainly Prabhupada wrote in this chapter that Ramananda Roy was Vishaka. And certainly that comes up in our literature.
Well, I don't dispute that. I'm just saying that he's probably following in Bhaktivinoda Thakur's footsteps because that's what he wrote.
I'm not thinking you're disputing it. I'm working from this.
Okay.
So now we have sources in our tradition. And so who's Ramananda Roy? He's a Gopi. How else could he talk about all this Gopi Bhav? How else could he articulate these things so deeply? And so given that we're followers of Prabhupada, most probably we should side with Prabhupada as our first line of defense, as our first statement on the subject, and go with Vishaka. Now, if the Gorganadish Deepika says Lalita Devi, I'd have no problem including that as well, because it's perfect. I mean, Ramananda Roy now represents both principal gopis standing on Radha and Krishna's side. So that works just fine. And then the Arjuna Gopa, and Arjunia Gopi, these are different ways in which Ramananda Roy manifests depending on the mood the Lord is in. So just like Gadadhar is Radharani if Mahaprabhu is Krishna. But if Mahaprabhu is Radharani, then you think of Gadadhar as Lalita. And so everybody always morphs according to the Lord's mood and the position the Lord's taking in the pastime. So whether it's Lalita or Vishaka, either one of which I think is great and just fine for this, you've got Ramananda Roy manifesting most appropriately in a mood which was appropriate for the topic being discussed and the mood of the Lord in these pastimes. So then if the Lord was more in the mood of Krishna, then Ramananda Roy would manifest the Arjuna. If the Lord was more in the mood of a cowherd boy, then you've got him manifesting as an appropriate Gopa, because all the people in the lower Leelas have a form in Vrindavan. And then if you want to see Ramananda Roy in a Manjari form, which is sort of just touched on a little bit in this chapter, then Arjunia Gopi, which would be the name of a Manjari, a sub Gopi, is mentioned. And so I think, all of those work together just fine. They don't really, it might seem like they create some kind of a problem, But the problem is if you think they can only be one static person, but as the Lord manifests a variety of pastimes, then the devotees have to morph into appropriate forms to join him in those pastimes. Just like Sri Dhamma ultimately becomes Garuda. Garuda in Vaikuntha is an incarnation of Sri Dhamma in Vrindavan. And so you get these kind of things, where as the Lord moves down into Vishnu, into various Leelas, the devotees from Vrindavan accompany him and they participate with him. And so Gaur Leela is ultimately viewed as a counter manifestation of Krishna Leela, where one personality will play multiple parts, more so than they will in Vrindavan. Because in Vrindavan, you've just got a whole universe of people. And in Mahaprabhu's pastimes, the way our acharyas see it, one person in Gaur Leela will play multiple parts in Braj Leela. And the thread of continuity is that they're always matching up to a mood that the Lord displayed with them. And so Ramananda Roy is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's best friend. And if you view Mahaprabhu as Krishna, then Arjuna and Arjuna Gopa become good. If you view Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as Radharani, then Lalita, Vishaka, and Arjunia Gopi become apropos. And in this way, you can see Ramananda Roy morphing alongside the Lord and manifesting an appropriate personality from Krishna Leela, depending on what the mood of the Lord is in a given pastime.
Even Haridas Thakur, I remember reading that he was Prahlad Maharaj and Lord Brahma as well. So it's not uncommon to have more.
Prahlad Maharaj, because he got beaten in 22 marketplaces, and Lord Brahma, who got a little too proud of his position, therefore he got to get knocked down, and so he got knocked down and took a Muslim birth, something like that. They find some similarity. Something happened in the Leela that just seemed like, oh, this reminds me of that pastime. He must be manifesting that personality from that pastime. So you'll always find this. There's always going to be some reason. It's not just arbitrary, but there's something that they did, some association with Mahaprabhu, some particular Leela, and that gave the spark. That must be who it was.
If you indulge me, I want to read you something else, because you were mentioning, very interestingly, you were mentioning that above all scriptural conclusions, one has to resort to prose and poetry and plays, dramaturgy, as to use your word. So here, Rupa Manjari is speaking about Rupa Goswami, a follower. Rupa Manjari is a follower of the Sakis Lalita and Vishaka, who are non-different from Ramananda Roy. Rupa Goswami discussed the subject of his two plays, Lalita Madhava and Vidagdha Madhava, with Ramananda. When Ramananda asked to hear a verse about the author's worshipable deity, Rupa recited the second verse of the first act, the play's Mangala Charana. I can read the Sanskrit if you wish, otherwise I'll just go directly to the English. The elevated, effulgent taste of Savior is the wealth of devotional love. The Lord never gives it at any time, yet out of his desire to distribute this treasure to the world, he has become incarnate in his golden form in this age of coral. The son of Chachi is like a lion. May he dwell in the cave of your hearts forever. When Ramananda Roy heard his verse, he began to praise Rupa Goswami with what seemed like 1,000 tongues. He said that Rupa could only have written such an accurate portrayal of these difficult concepts as a result of the Lord's mercy. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, Rupa Goswami slipped into his plays a glorification of Mahaprabhu. And then Ramananda Roy asked him to read, who is your worshipful deity? And he reads this verse about Mahaprabhu. Mahaprabhu became disturbed. It's in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. It's in Adi Leela chapter 1. And so Ramananda Roy knew what to ask. They glorified Mahaprabhu. Mahaprabhu became disturbed and said, Vishnu, this is not appropriate. This is too high. And so that's what was going on there. Ramananda Roy was drawing out Rupa Goswami's description of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as the Lord being most munificent. And here's why he's most munificent, because he's relishing the love of Radharani. And therefore the scraps around his table is the love of Radharani. And therefore his followers end up with the love of Radharani, obviously in the form of manjaris in an appropriate way. but you got the Lord who's relishing this incredibly high selfish desire to understand the love of Radharani. But because he's the soul of the universe, his most selfish desire becomes the most munificent desire. And you have this reconciliation of the Lord's internal life, of his own evolution in infinitude, and then his blessing the world with something which otherwise nobody would be able to get. And so you have there a glorification of Lord Chaitanya as giving Radha Krishna Prem to the world, as relishing himself, as Lord Chaitanya being Radharani, as being Krishna in the mood of Radharani. And it was read in front of Mahaprabhu, who became disturbed by it. And Ramananda Roy had to calm him down and say, it's okay, it's all right, let it go. And you have him here as inspecting the poetry of Rupa Goswami and making sure it followed all the rules of dramaturgy. In this case, that a proper Mangala Charan was done. You know, and this is very formulaic. You have to say what the qualifications are, what's the result of hearing the poetry, who's the worshipful deity of the poetry. There's certain things called a chaturthi. And so it's certain things that are required in a proper Mangala Charan. And he was inspecting that to then, so everybody could relish in front of the Lord a glorification of the Lord. I got to go and jump on the altar and do arti. I will say this. There's one last thing. After this, they talk one more time, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, who's the most famous person? And he says the person who's famous because of their love for Krishna. Who's the wealthiest person? The person has a wealth of love for Radha and Krishna. What's the most painful thing? To be bereft of the association of devotees. What's the greatest thing? To be gifted the association of devotees. And they go through a conversation. Who's the greatest capitalist? The one who's earned the wealth of love of Krishna. And so they go through this, and a number of questions are asked to Ramananda Roy in rapid fire succession, almost like a quick take. And Ramananda Roy answers that devotion, the devotees, the association of devotees, love for Krishna, these are the most valuable things in the world. They should be pursued. And they're the greatest poetry. They're the greatest asset. They're the greatest wealth. They're the greatest fame. They're the greatest joy. They're the greatest happiness. And so it finishes, and it's amazing though, but they discuss such high topics, but then they finish in a really grounded way, that's very digestible for devotees. Even though they reach up to the moon and touch these high topics, they come back down and bring it back down in like I said, in a very appropriate way. Sarvama Prabhu, you want to finish?
I just want to say, give us 20 seconds to thank you. Please, devotees, unmute yourselves. Also put the video and tell what you think about what you heard and his delivery, please. And my name and the name of everybody else. I can't be thankful enough. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Please. Can you please express yourself?
Hare Krishna, very, very, very insightful.
Thank you, Tukaram Prabhu.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tukaram Prabhu.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, thank you so much.
It was excellent presentation. Haribol.
Jai.
Okay. So please don't get puffed up. Go do the artic and be a servant again.
Very good. Thank you very much, Prabhu. Very nice.
Thank you, devotees. Thank you, Sarvama Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, devotees, and we'll see you soon. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.